Wyoming Territory. Winter, 1881. The kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. Pull back far enough, and Wyoming in November looks like the end of something. Iron sky pressed flat against a land that has stopped pretending to be gentle. Snooping sideways across the Powder River Basin. Nothing out here but wind and cattle and the particular essence of a place that has outlasted everyone who ever tried to leave a mark on it. Closer now, a ridge, a ranch. Smoke rising from one chimney, thin, struggling. The smoke of a fire someone forgot to tend. Closer still, a kitchen window, and behind it, a woman standing alone at a cold stove in a cold room, flour on her hands, eyes steady, jaw steady. She is not what this place expected. Outside, 24 men are already laughing. She hasn't walked through the door yet. She's about to. Wyoming Territory. November 1881. The kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. It just comes in. Through the walls, through the wool, through the spaces between your ribs where warmth used to live. Sky sat low and iron-colored over the Powder River Basin, pressing down on everything beneath it like a hand that had decided to stay. The town of Greystone sat low against the land like it was trying not to be noticed. 3 streets, 1 church. A saloon that doubled as a courthouse on Sundays, and a funeral parlor when the situation required. The kind of town where everyone knew your name and used it mostly when they had something unkind to say. The market opened at first light. They were so cheerful about it. Because the animals needed feeding, and the animals didn't consult the weather before deciding they were hungry. And there, at the far end of the market row, between a man selling frozen turnips and a woman selling nothing but suspicion, stood a small wooden stall. No decorations, no painted sign, just a plank of wood propped against a barrel, words carved into it by hand, uneven and a little crooked, like whoever made it wasn't entirely sure if the buzz was completely certain of the meaning. Nobody leaves my table hungry. That was all. That was enough. Her name was Nora Badett, 26 years old, hair the color of autumn mud, curling at the ends whether she wanted it to or not. Eyes brown and steady, kind of eyes that had absorbed enough disappointment. That additional disappointment no longer caught them off guard. She was not what people called small. She knew that. She had always known that. The world had made, she knew it from the time she was old enough to understand what the other children at Hill Orphanage meant when they looked at her plate and then at her and then at each other with that particular expression that required no translation. But Nora had learned something the other children hadn't. The kitchen didn't care what size you were. The fire didn't adjust its heat based on who was standing in front of it. The dough didn't pull away. And the people who ate what you made really ate, the kind where the fork slowed down and the eyes went somewhere private. Those people forgot, for a little while, whatever sharp thing they'd been carrying all day. That was worth something. That was worth everything, actually. She'd been selling at the Greystone market for 2 years now. Cornbread mostly. Biscuits with rendered lard and a whisper of rosemary. Occasionally a pot of something slow-cooked, carried on the wagon wrapped in burlap to hold the warmth in. She didn't get rich, she got by, which, for a woman with no family, no husband, no land, and no particular gift for making herself smaller than she was, getting by was its own kind of victory. He appeared between one breath and the next. No wagon, no announcement. Just a man who was suddenly there, the way a storm arrives. You don't see it coming until you feel the temperature drop. Tall, the kind of tall that carried its own quiet, like the height required careful management. Coat the color of charcoal, worn at the elbows and clean everywhere else. Dark hair with silver pressed into the temples. His self-search suggests he'd not arrived at his age without cost. Eyes gray and absolutely still. Not the still of peace. The still of a man who has made decisions and lived with them. He stopped in front of her stall. Read the sign, not quickly. Not with the half attention most people gave it before moving on. He read it the way a man reads a contract, slowly, twice. Then he looked at her, and here was the thing. The thing Nora would return to later, alone in the dark when sleep declined to come. He didn't look her over. He just looked at her, like she was a person. Fully and without adjustment. Without the small flicker behind the eyes that happened when people registered her body, and then worked to pretend they hadn't. He simply looked. And then without greeting or preamble, or any of the social cushioning that made conversation easier but harder, he said, "You ever cooked for people who didn't deserve it?" Nora blinked. What kind of question? Is he buying cornbread or is he? She looked at him straight. Every day, she said. For 10 years running, something moved in his face, not quite a smile, more like the memory of one held back by long practice. Good, good, he said. Then Holt's Ridge won't be a problem. His name was Silas Holt. That much she gathered in the 4 minutes the conversation lasted, which was its entire length. Captain Silas Holt, 40 years old, though he carried himself like a man who had lived considerably more than that in experience and was tired without being broken. Former U.S. Army officer, current owner of Holt's Ridge, the largest cattle operation in the Powder River Basin. 24 men working the land, the fences, the cattle, the relentless machinery of keeping a ranch alive through a Wyoming winter. And no cook. His cook, a man named Fletcher who'd held the position for 7 years, had come down with typhoid fever 3 weeks prior. Died on a Tuesday. No warning, no ceremony, no one lined up to replace him. 24 hungry men, a Wyoming winter closing in from every direction, and a rancher standing at a market stall at first light, reading a hand-carved sign the way other men read scripture. Monday, he said. He set money on the plank between them. Enough, more than enough. Can you be ready? Monday is 4 days from now. I have never cooked for more than 8 people at one time. I don't know this man. I don't know that ranch. I've heard things about that ranch, actually. None of them particularly. Yes, Nora said. Silas Holt picked up his hat, settled it back on his head, and walked away. He did not look back. Nora looked at the money on the plank, then at the space where he had been, then at her cornbread. Well, she thought. That happened. The wagon ride to Holt's Ridge took the better part of 2 hours. The driver was a young hand named Pruitt. 17, jaw still deciding its final shape, eyes that had already learned to observe without appearing to. He said 4 words the entire journey. 3 of them were, "Don't touch that side." Nora sat in the back with her trunk, her knives wrapped in oilcloth, her cast-iron skillet that she would sooner leave behind than a limb, and 2 cast-iron pots that had belonged to the woman who raised her, not her real mother. Her mother over hill, a cook named Mrs. Hatch, who died when Nora was 14 and left her exactly 2 things: the pots and the knowledge of what to do with them. The landscape opened as they rode. Wyoming in November was not beautiful the way a painting was beautiful. It was beautiful the way a hard truth was beautiful. Without softness, without apology, without any interest in whether you found it comfortable. The sky pressed iron gray on every side. The grass, what remained of it, lay flat and straw-colored under wind and weight. Cattle stood in loose clusters near the frozen creek beds, breathing steam into the cold. Then the ridge appeared. Holt's Ridge rose from the plain like something that had decided to stay. The main house sat at the top, stone foundation, frame, 2 stories, built for function rather than impression. Below it, 3 barns, a long bunkhouse, equipment sheds, a smokehouse, corral fencing that stretched farther than the gray light allowed her to see. Every board and nail had earned its position. This was a place that had been worked into existence and was being worked to keep it there. Nora felt something in her chest she didn't have a name for. It's just a ranch. Stop making it something it isn't. You are here to cook, Nora. Cook, leave, or cook and stay. But do not make it more than it is before it's had the chance to be anything at all. The wagon stopped. Pruitt jumped down and began untying her trunk without a word, and then the men appeared. Not all at once. That would have been almost manageable. They came out in 2s and 3s from the bunkhouse, from the barn, from behind the equipment shed. 24 men in various states of mourning, which is to say, rough, cold-weathered, skeptical in the particular way of men who have been disappointed by circumstances, often enough that skepticism has become their default standing. They looked at Nora. Nora looked back, and then the voice came from the right, deep, built to carry across a yard full of cattle noise. "Boss, bring us a stove or a whole supply wagon?" Laughter, the easy, unconsidered laughter of men who have been making the same kinds of jokes for so long they no longer notice whether the jokes are kind. The man leaning against the fence post nearest the bunkhouse door was big through the shoulders, face broken and reset with the nose listing slightly left. Gray at the temples, dark everywhere else. A man who occupied space as a matter of philosophy, Gideon Marsh. She would learn that name within the hour. Right now she could stop walking. She could say something back. She had something available. She'd been sharpening things her entire life. She knew exactly how to use a sharp word and where to place it, or she could keep moving. Her boots found the frozen ground. 1 step, another, past the fence line, past the laughter, past the men still watching to see what she would do with what had been said. You kicked to the kitchen door, pushed it open, stepped inside, pulled it shut behind her. The kitchen was cold, not just cool, cold in the way of rooms that had been abandoned. The fire had been dead for days, ash in the hearth, gray and undisturbed. The pots on the shelf still wearing the remnants of whatever Fletcher had last cooked, beginning to rust at the rims. Shelves half empty, flour going stale in its sack. Lard solid in the pot. A single bag of cornmeal in the corner, older than it should have been. Nora stood in the center of it, breathed. Worse than the orphanage kitchen after Mrs. Hatch died. Not worse than the winter of '73 when the supply road flooded and there were 8 children and 2 cups of dried beans. Not worse than that. She unwrapped her knives, found flints, started the fire. By midnight she had cleaned the pots, restocked from the main house pantry, using written permission Silas had arranged in advance, assessed the full inventory, and settled on 3 decisions about the morning. By 4 she had been awake for 22 hours. She didn't sleep, she baked. Cornbread first. Her cornbread. Not Fletcher's, not any man's. Hers. Pan seared in cast iron until the bottom crust crackled when you pressed it. The inside soft and warm, the outside the particular gold that only came from knowing when to pull it. She made the cream sauce from what was available. Smoked pepper, a scrape of nutmeg, rendered fat cream from a jar left near the cold window. 24 plates. She had never set 24 plates in her life. She set them anyway, one at a time, steady. The bunkhouse bell rang at first light. She heard the boots. They came in loud, slapping snow from coats, elbowing each other, carrying the particular energy of men who have gone without decent food for weeks and won't admit how much they've missed it. Then they smelled it. The talking stopped. Not all at once, but one by one, the way candles go out. First the 2 men nearest the door, then the group behind them, then the last stragglers, coming in mid-sentence, trailing off the smells reached them. Cornbread, cream, smoke, warmth. The kind of warmth you taste before it touches your mouth. They sat. Nora stood behind the serving table, with her hands clasped behind her back, watching, not performing calm, actually calm, because this exact moment was the only place in the world where she understood without reservation what she was doing and why. They ate, slowly, at first, then less slowly. Forks pausing midair, eyes going somewhere private. The sound in the room shifting from boot scrape and chair creak to something quieter, something that had more in common with rest than with mealtime. No one said a word. Nora watched their faces the way she always watched faces. This was the real work, not the cooking. The cooking was the last step. The real work was reading what people carried and understanding what might, for a few minutes, set it down. She watched the slight relaxing around a jaw that meant the salt was right. The momentary closing of eyes that meant something beyond hunger was being addressed. Then movement on the right. Gideon Marsh. He pushed back his chair, stood, walked to the serving table, and set his plate down in front of her. Empty, scraped completely clean. He didn't look at her. His eyes rested somewhere near her left shoulder. His jaw moved like he was working through words that hadn't found their shape yet. He waited. Nora picked up the serving spoon, put more on his plate. Gideon Marsh took the plate, turned and walked back to his seat, and just before he cleared her sightline, just at the edge of it, she caught the corner of his mouth, moving upward, just slightly, just enough. Good, Nora thought. Now we know where we stand. The first week passed in a rhythm she built herself because no one else was going to build it for her. Rise before the roosters, fire going before the sky settled on a color. Bread first, always. Bread was the thing that said someone here thought ahead. Someone here considered you. Then whatever the main meal would be started low and slow because worked this land through a Wyoming winter. Deserved food that had been thought about before it reached the plate. She watched each of them. This was how she had always cooked, not from recipes alone, but from people. Callum Price, 17th Welsh by accent, quieter than any boy that age should be. He ate fast and defensively, like someone might take the plate if he slowed down. He never joked with the others. He sat at the edge of whatever cluster formed around him, present and separate at once. She noticed the way he scraped his fork, all the way to the rim, then back again, then once more across the center. The gesture of someone taught very early that nothing on a plate was incidental. Someone taught him that the hard way, she thought, or the hungry way, which is the same thing. The first night, she found him in the kitchen at 11:15, He froze in the doorway the way an animal freezes when it hasn't decided whether to bolt. They held still, both of them, for one long moment. Nora went back to wiping the counter. "Plate's on the left side of the table," she said, without turning. "Cloth over it. Put the cloth back when you're done." A pause. The sound of a plate lifted. A cloth moved. Quiet eating. Then footsteps retreating. In the morning the cloth was folded and replaced exactly as she'd left it. Edges aligned, corners tucked with more precision than she'd expected. She left a plate the next night, and the next. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. Silas Holt ate last, always last. Not first, the way some men in authority ate, claiming the best portion as confirmation of rank. Not separate, in his office, insulated from the table. Last, in line with the men, taking what remained, and there was always enough remaining, because she made certain of it. This was the thing Mrs. Hatch had pressed into her earliest. Cook for the appetite you haven't seen yet, Nora. Cook for the man who'll be last and think he doesn't deserve more. Silas ate with focus. Not joylessly, she watched too carefully to miss that difference, but with the attention of a man who had learned to hold pleasure at arm's length, who allowed himself the food but kept a measured distance from what it felt like. And then, when the dining room emptied and the sounds of the ranch settled into its ordinary evening register, he stayed. The first day's time she'd thought it was coincidence. He walked into the scullery, rolled up his suits and began washing the dishes. Nora stopped in the doorway. "What is?" That's not Mr. Holt." She kept her voice even. "That isn't required." "No," he agreed. He didn't stop. "You're the owner of this, I'm aware." He kept washing. Nora stood in the doorway another moment. "All right then." She went back to cooking the stove. They worked in the same silence for the better part of an hour. Not uncomfortable. Not warm yet either. Just two people in a kitchen, each doing a task, neither requiring anything from the other. But she noticed things. The way he handled the cast iron, with care, drying it before it could rust, returning it to the hook with attention. The way he stacked the bowls in a sequence that suggested he'd stacked them before and remembered exactly how they sat. He has done this before, she thought, in this kitchen. With someone else, she didn't say it. There were things that announced themselves clearly enough without help. The 8th night. She was looking for the goods skillet, the one she'd stored behind the second shelf to protect it from rough handling. She moved the loose board she'd noticed on day 1, filed it away in the category of things to remember, and found behind it, pressed between wood and wall, a book, small, leather-covered, worn at the edges in the way things are worn when they've been held all often and held with care. She almost put it back. "It's not yours, Nora." "Put it back." She opened it. The first page held a recipe for beef stew, written in a woman's hand, neat, precise, the penmanship of someone properly taught who had kept the lesson. Then another recipe, then another. And then, between the recipe for apple preserves and the one for corn pudding, a line that wasn't a recipe at all. "Silas ate today. First time since we lost the baby. He didn't say anything about how it tasted, he just cleaned the plate." I sat with that for a long time after he went out. Nora's hand went still. She read it again. "First time since we lost the baby." She turned the page. "He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't talk about much, but I've learned to read what he does instead of what he says." Tonight he stood at the window for a long time after supper. I thought about going to him, then I thought about not. I chose wrong. I know I chose wrong. But by the time I understood that, the moment had already passed. Nora sat down on the kitchen floor without quite intending to. "I'm frightened sometimes that I won't be strong enough to stay. I don't tell him that. He has enough to carry. But the truth of it is that this winter has asked more of me than I knew I had to give." She turned more pages, more recipes, more small entries, scattered between the practical, some instructions like some hidden in plain sight. A woman writing the interior life of her marriage in the margins of a cookbook. The only document in the house that belonged entirely to her, Margaret. The name was on the inside cover. Margaret Holt. Her book, her kitchen. Nora closed the book, sat with it in her lap. The fire ticked and settled. So that's what he's doing, she thought, every night. Standing at that basin in the dark. He's not being dutiful. He's staying close to the only person he loved by touching the things she touched. She understood that. God help her. She understood it completely. The way you understand something that has nothing to do with your mind and everything to do with the recipe below your ribs, where the ninja said to anyone, "Take up residence." She put the book back behind the loose board, settled the panel back into place, and returned to the fire. but she didn't forget a word of it at the end of the first week. Friday night. The temperature had dropped to something that had no polite name. The wind came off the mountains with genuine intent, finding every gap in the kitchen walls, making the fire labor twice as hard to hold the room. Nora was banking the embers for the night when she became aware of him. Not from footsteps. She had learned the particular weight and rhythm of his step, the way it fell like something being conserved. Not from words. Silas didn't use words to announce himself. Just the change in the air, the slight shift that meant the room now held someone in addition to her. She kept her back to him, finished banking the fire, heard him stop directly behind her, and then, careful, deliberate, the movement of a man making certain not to startle. Something settled onto her shoulders, wool, heavy, warm in the way that meant it had been held near heat here before it was placed, near a fire or against a body, long enough for the warmth to be intentional rather than incidental. She went very still. Don't make it. Don't assign, he's just, but she felt it. The warmth in the fabric that hadn't come from a hook on a cold wall, the deliberateness of the gesture. The fact that he had thought about this before walking through the door. He had made a decision. About her. She didn't turn around. After a moment, she heard him walk away. The door closed softly behind him. Nora stood at the cooling stove with his wool blanket around her shoulders, in a dead woman's kitchen, holding herself very still. Outside, the wind pressed against every surface it could find. Inside, something she had managed carefully for 26 years, pressed quietly and without apology, against something it had not encountered before. She pulled the blanket tighter, just for warmth. That was all she would let it be. Just for warmth. January 1882, the coldest month. Not cold the way November was cold, arriving fast with a knife edge, still carrying somewhere in its margins the faint memory of autumn. January in Wyoming was cold, the way a verdict was cold, final, without appeal. The kind of cold that stopped asking permission weeks ago and now simply occupied every room as a matter of settled fact. But inside Holt's Ridge kitchen something had shifted. Not loudly. Nothing announced it. It happened the way light changes in a room when someone opens a curtain that has been drawn for a long time. You look up and the real room is different without being able to name the exact moment it changed. Callum Price knocked on the kitchen door before entering now. Actual knuckles on actual wood, waiting for a response. The first time he did it, Nora stood at the stove for a full 3 seconds convinced she'd imagined it. Because in 2 months no one had knocked. Men came in and out of this kitchen the way came in and out of the barn, which was to be fair exactly how they had been treating it before she arrived. She opened the door. Callum stood on the step with a stack of firewood balanced above his own head, held with the total concentrations of someone who had decided this was going to go well and was refusing to negotiate with alternative outcomes. Thought you might need, he said. Then he waited, like he was asking permission to exist in the doorway. Don't make a thing of it, Nora. Don't turn it into something larger than left side of the hearth, she said. Stack it dry side out. He came in, did it exactly right, left without being asked. She stood there after the door closed. All right, she thought. All right then. Gideon Marsh had stopped making jokes, not with ceremony, not with a speech or an announcement, or any of the dramatic architecture of a man publicly deciding to be better. He simply stopped. One day, the comments were present, the sidelong remarks, the things said just past the edge of being directed at her but absolutely about her, and then they weren't. He started being first in line instead. Plate extended, eyes forward, moving through efficiently. He said thank you just once, in the second week of January, the way a man says a word that costs something he's budgeted for, carefully. Nora didn't mark it, didn't mention it, didn't do anything that might make him conscious of being watched in the act of becoming someone slightly different, because that particular awareness tended to ruin the whole enterprise. She kept cooking, which was the point. The trouble, and it was a specific, manageable, entirely inconvenient trouble, was that Silas Holt was still washing dishes every single night. And Nora was still noticing, not merely by the fact of it, which she had filed weeks ago, under things occurring in this kitchen that I am not assigning significance to. She was noticing the specifics. The way he handled Margaret's cast iron pot, the one Nora had found in the back of the storeroom on day 3 and returned to use. He washed it at a different pace than the others, slower, more present, like he was aware specifically and continuously of what he was holding. She knew why now. She knew because of the book behind the loose board, which she had not read again, had not gone back, not even once. Well, not more than twice. And the second time was only to verify what she thought she remembered from the first time, which barely counts. Knowing changed things regardless, because when she watched him at the basin in lamplight, sleeves rolled past the elbows, working without sound. She wasn't only watching a man wash dishes. She was watching a man remain close to the only person he'd loved by touching the things she had touched, maintaining a proximity that had no other available form. That was considerable weight for a kitchen at 10 o'clock at night. Stop it, Nora. You are here to cook. That is the arrangement. Cook, be paid. Do not construct an interior life out of a man's dishwashing habits. She went back to cleaning the stove. He went back to washing, and the silence between them continued, as it had been continuing for weeks, to say things that neither of them had yet put into words. The last Saturday in January. That was when the coach arrived. Nora heard it before she saw it. The sound of a well-maintained rig, horses properly kept, wheels recently greased. Not the sound of a working ranch, which rattled and clanked with the honest percussion of use. This was something that moved through the world differently, with the particular smoothness of things that had never been required to applause for themselves. She was at the kitchen window when it came through the gate. Black lacquer, Philadelphia trim. You could read it in the proportions, the hardware, the way it held itself on the dirt road, like it found the arrangement mildly offensive, but had decided to endure it. The woman who stepped out was the same. She wore a wool coat the color of deep pine, fitted through the shoulders, brass buttons, hair black as fresh ink arranged high and with precision. Boots that were clean, not clean from recent wiping, but clean in the way that suggested they were rarely required to meet actual ground. She was beautiful in the way of something assembled rather than grown. Every element considered, nothing accidental. Of course, obviously, because this was apparently the next thing. Nora stopped thinking and watched. The woman surveyed the ranch, the way someone surveys a property they are calculating. Then, and she looked at the men who had stopped their work to look at her. Then at the main house. Then, and this was the moment Nora would return to later, in the dark, in the specific way you revisit moments that mattered. She looked at the kitchen window, found Nora looking back. 1 second, maybe 2. The woman's mouth curved, barely. River curves, smooth, unhurried, entirely certain of its direction and unconcerned with the terrain. Then she looked away and walked toward the main house as though she'd been expected. I don't know who that is, Nora thought, but I know exactly what that was. Her name was Vivian Boldcroft, widow, Philadelphia. Money that had been accumulating quietly across 3 generations, while everyone else in the country was occupied with other in crops. And what the bank might do if the season went wrong again. Nora learned this not from being told. She learned it the way she learned most useful things. By being present in rooms where people forgot she was furniture that could hear. She learned it from the dining room that first evening, where Vivienne sat across from Silas and spoke about land with the particular fluency of someone who has always regarded it as a category of asset, rather than a thing that grows food and buries people. Powder River Basin, Eastern Investment Interests. The frontier, she suggested with a careful smile, was simply opportunity that hadn't yet been organized, and Silas was carrying debt. 2 bad seasons, drought the first year and the second year worse, had taken enough from him that the bank in Cheyenne was asking questions he didn't have good answers to. Vivian had answers. Very organized, very well-capitalized answers. And she brought them to the table alongside a smile that traveled exactly as far as she intended and not a fraction further. She began eating dinner at the ranch every evening, sitting near Silas, speaking in the particular register of someone who understands that the closer a person must lean to hear you, the more significant the words feel. She was skilled at this, genuinely, observably skilled. The men noticed her the way men notice an unexpected fire in a familiar room, aware of the heat repositioning slightly, uncertain whether to move closer or further away. She was polite to everyone, including Nora, especially Nora, and that specific emphasis was what required watching. The night after she arrived, Vivian came into the kitchen while Nora was plating the dessert. Apple preserves, biscuits, a small pot of honeyed cream. She stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen with an expression of composed, genuine seeming appreciation. "You've done remarkable things in here," she said. Her voice was warm. Practiced warmth, but warm. Nora looked up. The men seemed very well fed. A small pause, placed with surgical precision.
Considering. There it was. Not an insult. Couldn't be named as one. More like a door left slightly open.
The kind you could choose to walk through or not.
But either way, the draft had already reached you.
Considering the limited resources, considering the conditions, considering you, Nora set the serving spoon down with care. Is there something you need from the kitchen, Mrs. Aldcroft? A beat, just admiring the work. Another small smile. I'll let you get back to it. She left. Nora stood at the counter. That's the mechanism, she thought. That's precisely how it works. Not a blow, a bruise. The kind you don't discover until you press on it later and find it deeper than you expected. She picked up the spoon, kept plating, because the men were hungry, and the dessert course needed finishing, and she was not going to give a woman in clean boots the satisfaction of an unfinished plate. The pattern established itself over the following days. Vivian said things that were technically compliments, delivered with the particular skill of someone who had learned early that ugly words were unnecessary when pleasant-sounding ones could be arranged correctly. It takes a certain kind of woman to manage a kitchen of this scale, said with the inflection that made certain kind of woman mean something other than what those words said on their face. I imagine the men to find it comforting, something familiar. Said to Silas in the dining room, voice not quite low enough. Comforting, familiar, the words you used for worn rugs and reliable lamp posts. Functional, unremarkable. She clearly works very hard. Said to a neighboring hand's wife passing through, accompanied by a look that communicated everything the sentence had declined to carry, and each one of these things, taken alone, was nothing. Together they were architecture. The architecture of a woman who had learned very early that you didn't need to say ugly things if you were precise enough with the pleasant ones. Nora knew this architecture intimately. She had been living inside versions of it her whole life. Orphanage matron who said Nora is so devoted to the kitchen in the tone that meant Nora has correctly identified the only space where her presence is something other than inconvenient. The market customers who admired her hands while looking deliberately away from the rest of her. Wonderful hands. Yes, just the hands. She kept cooking. She kept watching. She said nothing. Because saying something was what Vivienne wanted. Some unguarded response that could be smoothed over later with a apology and a look exchanged with Silas that communicated, you see what I'm managing here. I'm trying my very best. Nora didn't give her that. She gave her perfect biscuits instead and watched. Pearl Running Water came to the ranch on a Tuesday in the second week of February. She arrived the way Nora would come to understand she always arrived, without announcement and precisely according to a schedule that only Pearl maintained. Wagon loaded with stoppered bottles and wrapped bundles of dried plants. Hair gray-streaked and braided. Face in the way of someone who had spent decades outside, not from lack of choice, but from a settled relationship with weather as fact, riot rather than obstacle. She was Shoshone, 58 years old, widowed 12 years prior. She made her living moving remedies and treatments across the Powder River Basin, and people bought from her for one straightforward reason. They worked. Nora paid what Pearl asked without bargaining, and asked her name before asking what she had in stock. Pearl paused at that, just briefly, a small recalibration. Then she answered, they actually talked, which was something neither of them did often at a ranch full of men who treated conversation as the gap between one task and the next. Pearl spoke in a way that approached subjects from an angle. You'd follow what seemed to be one conversation and realize she'd been conducting one entirely and underneath it, arriving at the actual subject so gradually you couldn't identify the moment of arrival. She was explaining the correct ratio for a willow bark preparation when she said, "The woman in the pine coat." Nora kept sorting the herbs in front of her. What about her? You know who she is. A widow from Philadelphia with an interest in acquiring land. Pearl set down the bundle she was holding. She and the rancher's wife were close. From before they came west. School, I think. East somewhere. Nora's hands went still. How do you know this? I crossed this valley all year, Pearl said, a small movement of her shoulder. People speak while I'm working. They forget that I'm listening. Nora considered this. There's more, Pearl said. She loved him. Pearl said it plainly, the way you name a thing that simply exists. Before his wife. Long before. She chose silence because the friendship mattered more to her than saying it. She kept choosing silence year after year, until she'd convinced herself the feeling had passed. A pause. It hadn't. Oh, that changes? No, it doesn't change anything, does it? And now Nora said carefully, she's here. Now she's here, Pearl agreed. And I don't believe she knows what she wants. I think she knows what she lost, or what she believes she lost, and she came back to see if she could locate it again. Pearl looked at Nora directly. No diagonal approach. Straight. Except what she lost was never here. It lived in her own understanding of herself, and that's a considerably harder loss to recover from. Nora looked at her. Pearl picked up her bundle again, back to the practical work. Willow bark, she said, 2 parts water to 1 part bark. Sss, don't boil. I know, Nora said. I know you know. Pearl handed her the bundle. I'm just talking while I work. March arrived. The ice at the creek's edges loosened, not breaking yet, but beginning its negotiation with the possibility of spring. The light held on 20 minutes longer each day, and you noticed it the way you noticed something you'd stopped expecting, with a careful tentative hope that didn't want to commit itself too early. The supply wagon came through from the south in the second week of March. 3 men, a mule team, goods from the trading post in Glenrock, blankets, salt, hardware, dried provisions, and something else. Something that traveled without taking up space in the wagon. That moved from person to person the way fire crossed dry grass. Fast, indifferent, entirely uninterested in fairness or timing, or whether a ranch had already had a difficult enough year. By Tuesday noon, Hector Biggs was shaking at the dinner table. By Tuesday sundown, 3 more men were in their bunks. High fevers, skin the color of old paper, eyes too bright and too empty in the same moment. By Wednesday morning, 15 out of 24. The bunkhouse became a sick ward between 1 hour and the next. The transformation so rapid it had the quality of a fever dream. The sheer space made wrong by what was happening inside it. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway and did the arithmetic. Cheyenne, 3 days' ride under good conditions. These were not good conditions. The southern was still in river. A man had been lost on it in January, and they'd recovered him in April, after the thaw. There was no doctor available. There was no route to one that made sense. There was Pearl, and there was the kitchen. She sent Callum for Pearl at a flat gallop. He went without asking why. 6 weeks ago, he would have looked at the floor and waited for an older man to confirm the order. Now he simply went. The horse was saddled and through the gate before Nora had finished the sentence. Pearl arrived 2 hours later. She took one look at the bunkhouse, asked 3 questions. How long has it been progressing? What color is the fever Swiss? Are their tongues cracked or smooth? And walked directly to the kitchen with Nora. They stood on opposite sides of the work table. Not 2 strangers thrown together by emergency. 2 people with different knowledge organized toward the same end. Slippery film of the stomach, Pearl said. Willow bark for the fever, yarrow for the sweating, not to stop it, to move it through faster. Food, Nora said. They need to keep something down, very thin, bone broth. Nothing else until the 2nd day, then we see. Can you make enough? Nora looked at the stove, the pots, the stores she'd been building for 2 months. Because she placed her doors ran out, and her body remembered what that felt like and had never stopped preparing against it. Yes, she said, then we work. 72 hours. That was what it took. 72 hours during which Nora did not sleep, did not sit, did not stop long enough for her body to register what she was requiring of it. Fire burning before dawn each day. Beef bones cracked and roasted first to deepen the color, then covered with water, simmered 8 hours minimum. She staggered the pots, so there was always something ready, always something coming behind it. 3 fires running at once. 2 in the main kitchen hearths. 1 in the second. She'd cleaned out 10 in her 2nd week without anyone noticing or thanking her for it, which she had neither expected nor required. Pearl moved through the bunkhouse with her remedies. Nora carried broth. Back and forth across the yard. 20 steps in health. Something longer and more complicated at hour 30, the cold rising through the soles of her boots with every crossing, the distance between kitchen and bunkhouse, acquiring a quality that had nothing to do with its actual measurement. She counted things to stay oriented, the men who could drink without fighting it. 8 by the end of the 2nd day, the men who were past the point of fighting anything. 3, and those 3 drove her faster than fear alone would have. Hector Biggs, who had once tracked a boot print across her clean kitchen floor, and neither noticed nor apologized, lay in his bunk with his eyes half open and his breathing shallow. She sat beside him at hour 40 and talked, not about anything consequential, the weather that was coming, what she was going to make when this was over, whether the creek would break fully by April or hold the ice a few weeks longer. He didn't respond. She kept talking, because silence in that room felt like a door opening onto something she wasn't ready to accept, and she had always done her best work in opposition to the things she wasn't ready to accept. Vivian Aldcroft remained in the main house. This went unremarked by everyone except Gideon Marsh, who said exactly one thing about it to the wall of the bunkhouse while helping Nora Bruth on the morning of the second day, not looking at her. Some people are at their best in the ordinary. They go quiet in the emergency. He didn't look at Nora when he said it. She didn't look at him, but she heard it, and somewhere inside the woman who had been running on bone broth and will for 48 hours, something small and very tired felt, not vindicated, not triumphant, just seen. Yes, she thought. Some people do. In the main house, Vivian was conducting a reckoning she had not planned for and did not know how to manage. She had come to Wyoming with a structure financially sound, logically defensible. Emotionally, she had told herself repeatedly that it was not emotional. It was practical. There was land to acquire. There was a man with whom she had unresolved history and an outstanding debt she could leverage into a different kind of arrangement. There was an opportunity with a limited window. She had not accounted for this. She stood at the parlor window and watched a woman she had spent 3 weeks carefully diminishing walk back and forth across a frozen yard in the dark, carrying soup to men who had said unkind things about the shape of her body 3 months ago, walking steadily, without drama, without keeping score. Vivian pressed her hand against the cold glass. Shame arrived as a word, stayed briefly, and departed before she examined it carefully enough to let it settle. Something else then, something with less of a name, the specific, unwelcome discomfort of watching someone be, clearly, demonstrably, without effort or performance, a better version of the person Vivian had been trying to construct herself into for 35 years. She left the window, sat down, sat with that for a long time. Hour 71. The third night. The kitchen held its warmth now with a quality that had become almost structural. 3 days of continuous fire absorbed into the walls, the floor, the work table, the spaces between boards. The pots murmured with long cooking. The smell was everything Mrs. Hatch had ever taught her, distilled and concentrated. Bone and smoke and time and the specific patience required to roll into something that could sustain a person. Lifted the ladle she was going to pour, except the ladle was heavier than it had been an hour before, which didn't make sense, because it was the same ladle. She looked at her hand holding it. Her hand appeared fine. The ladle appeared fine. She just couldn't quite. The ladle hit the floor. The sound was very loud in the quiet kitchen, and then Nora followed it. Not slowly, not gracefully, the way a structure goes when it has been holding past its capacity. All at once, and then it's down. She caught the edge of the counter, held for 1 second too. Then her knees found the floor, and the world went the particular gray of a sky an hour before snow. She didn't lose consciousness entirely. She was aware of the floor, cold, hard, solid, in the way that something unyielding becomes a kind of comfort when everything else has become uncertain. She was aware of the fire, still burning. Good, she thought, from somewhere that felt far away. Someone needs to keep that. Then hands, large hands. Calloused through the palm, roughened at the knuckles. The hands of a man who worked land, who knew the difference between pressure that broke things and pressure that held them. Careful in the specific way of someone who handles both rough and fragile things and has learned where the line falls between. She was lifted, not managed, moved because she was in the way. Carried the way you carry something that matters, with attention distributed differently than it would be for simple weight. Don't, she started, don't make this into, you're just exhausted and he's only. She stopped thinking and let herself be carried. When she opened her eyes, the light was the thin pale gold of very early morning. Not the kitchen. A different room, small, warm. A quilt she didn't recognize, tucked with someone else's attention. Extra care at the shoulders, at the sides, at every place warmth could find a way out. The tucking of someone trying to keep something in. Silas was on the floor beside the bed, back against the wall, elbows on his knees. His eyes were open. He had not slept. The room was very quiet. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and neither of them spoke because the room was already full enough that words would have been an imposition. Then Nora said, "The fire in the kitchen, Gideon's watching it. The broth on the left side needs to come off in." Pearl handled it. Hector, breathing easier. A pause, all of them, breathing easier. She closed her eyes for a moment, opened them. He was still there. "You stayed all night," she said, not questioned. He didn't answer directly. "I told you," he said. His voice was low and carrying something in it that he was not entirely managing. "I've made that mistake once. Not again." He meant Margaret. He meant not being there. He meant don't. "Nora, don't Bill." But his hand was around hers. She hadn't registered it until now. He was holding her hand the way you hold something when the frightening part has passed. But your body doesn't yet know how to release what it was gripping. She didn't pull away. She didn't speak either, because there were things in that room larger than her words, and she was too exhausted and too honest to pretend she didn't know it. 2 mornings after her collapse, Nora walked into the bunkhouse to check on the men. Gideon Marsh was in the doorway, hat in hand, eyes on the floor. "Day you arrived," he said. Nora waited. "What I said when you came through the gate." His jaw worked in the way it did when he was pushing through something that required effort to carry. "That wasn't right." "No," Nora said simply. "Not because of this." He gestured, vaguely, at the bunkhouse, at the 3 days that had just happened, at everything. "That's not why it wasn't right. It wasn't right because you're a person and I didn't treat you like one. That's all of it." The room was occupied by men who were all simultaneously finding other things to look at, walls and ceilings, and the exceptional interest of the floor near their feet. "All right," Nora said. Gideon looked up, surprised. "All right," he said.
"All right,"
she said again. "You said it. I heard it. Now we know." She walked past him into the bunkhouse to check on Hector Biggs. Gideon stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he put his hat back on and went back to work. Pearl found Vivian in the kitchen near midnight, 2 nights after Nora's collapse. Pearl had returned for additional supplies and found the kitchen empty of Nora, fire low, and Vivian Aldcroft standing at the work table with both flat on the wood surface, just standing there. Looking at the kitchen, the herb bundles Nora had hung from the beam, the cast iron arranged on the wall hooks by size, the edge of the work table worn smooth by Margaret's years and now Nora's, layers indistinguishable from each other, like rings inside timber. Pearl quietly sat on the stool near the low hearth, began sorting through her bag without commentary. Vivian didn't move for a long time. Then, "I've been doing this wrong." Pearl didn't ask what she meant. "Not only here," Vivian said. Her voice was controlled, educated, steady even now. "For a very long time. I've been arranging, positioning, calculating where to stand and what to say and how to present myself correctly." She paused, and it has never... She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at the kitchen. "Has never felt like that." Pearl untied a bundle of dried stems, began separating them. "I knew Margaret," Vivian said. "I know. I came here because..." She stopped again. "Rebuilt. I told myself a story about why I came. It was well constructed. It had financial logic and sound justification, and I had believed it for long enough that it felt like the truth." Pearl worked steadily through her bundle. "The story wasn't true," Vivian said. "The stories we tell ourselves to keep moving rarely are," Pearl said. "That isn't a failing. It's just how people function. We carry them until we can't anymore." Vivian looked at the kitchen for another moment. Then she straightened, picked up her coat from the chair. "I'm going back to Cheyenne in the morning. Not a question, not a request." The sound of a woman who has spent a long time arranging things for other people, finally arranging something for herself. "I have work to do that isn't here." Pearl nodded, eyes on the herbs. Vivian moved toward the door, stopped. "The debt," she said. "The bank in Cheyenne. I'm going to settle it." A pause that carried something in it she wasn't going to name. "Not for him. Because Margaret asked me once to look after him if she couldn't. I've been doing that wrong. This is the right way." She left. Pearl sat in the kitchen a while longer. The kind of sitting you do when a room has held something important and you want to give it time to settle before you move through it. Morning came gray and cold. Silas stood on the porch and watched Vivian's coach move down the ridge road toward the valley floor. In his hand, the envelope she'd left. Inside, paperwork from the Cheyenne Bank, settled, stamped, finalized. And one line in Vivian's precise hand: "Margaret always said you deserve to be happy. I spent a long time not understanding what that meant. I think I understand it now. Don't waste any more time." He read it twice, folded it, put it in his coat pocket. He stood there after the coach had gone, watching Wyoming spread itself out beneath the ridge. Ice on the creek catching the weak morning light. Cattle moving slow through the south field, steam rising from their backs into the cold air. Then he turned and walked toward the kitchen, where Nora sat at the table near the window, both hands around a tin cup of tea, still pour from the past 3 days, watching the steam rise. She looked up when the door opened. He looked at her. The kitchen held them both, the way it had been holding things for years, through everything that had happened inside its walls. Quietly, without ceremony, with nothing to offer except warmth, which, it turned out, was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. April 1882. The ice broke on a Thursday. Not the way winter ends in paintings. Gradual, gentle, one considered snowflake at a time releasing its grip. It broke the way Wyoming did everything, all at once, with noise. The creek cracking open like something that had been holding its breath since November, and finally on a Thursday morning in April, simply couldn't anymore. Nora heard it from the kitchen. She stopped what she was doing, stood still, listened to the sound of something frozen deciding to move again. Then she went back to the bread. Because the bread needed another 12 minutes and then it needed to come out, and the creek's opinion on the matter was not relevant to the timing. The bread didn't care about what the ice was doing. The bread had its own requirements, but she was smiling while she tended it, just slightly, just to herself, the kind of a smile that doesn't need an audience because it isn't for one. She was stronger now, not the announcing kind of strong, not the kind that arrived with observable energy and visible recovery. The quiet kind. The kind that returned in increments small enough that you didn't notice each one individually, only the accumulation. First the steadiness came back to her hands, then the ability to stand a full shift without her vision softening at the margins, then sleep that was actually sleep rather than the gray half-consciousness of a body too depleted to go further but too wired to go under, and then last of all, the thing she hadn't known she'd lost until she found it again. Appetite. Not only for food, though that too. Pearl had been unambiguous on the subject. Eat more, eat now, eat before you think you need to, because your body is behind the calendar on this one. But appetite in the broader sense, for the morning, for the particular satisfaction of bread that came out right, for the sound of boots on the porch steps and knowing whose they were before the door opened, for the day, simply, for the fact of it. She hadn't noticed that going. She noticed it coming back. The apron appeared on a Tuesday. She came into the kitchen, before sunrise the way she always did, started the fire the way she always did, and turned to lift her apron from the hook beside the door. The hook was empty. What? She looked around the kitchen, there on the work table. Probably more care than the men of Holt's Ridge typically applied to fold anything, which is to say, folded deliberately, edges considered, what addressed. She crossed to it, unfolded it. Deep green fabric, good linen, not cut from an old shirt or repurposed from a feed sack. Someone had sourced this with intention, across the front in thread that ran through several different colors, because it appeared that multiple contributors had used whatever they had available. The keeper of Holt's Hearth. She stood there, read it again. The keeper of Holt's Hearth, and beneath the words, names. Every man on the ranch, stitched and written and pressed into the fabric, with varying degrees of technical skill, which is to say, most of them looked like they'd been done by men who held a needle the way they held a fence post, with force, with determination, and with limited experience of the finer points. Gideon Mershashnishin was first. His stitching was large, slightly uneven, pressed deep into the fabric like he'd been making absolutely certain it wasn't going anywhere. Callum Price's name came next, neat and careful, the hand of properly taught who had retained the instruction, then the others, all 24. Including the 30 who had been Siskis's longest and were still moving through their days with the careful deliberateness of men, relearning what their bodies could do. 24 names. Nora put both hands flat on the work table, breathed in. Don't cry into the bread dough, Nora. That is a rule. That has always been a rule, and this is not the morning too. She pressed her lips together, picked up the apron, put it on. Tied it at the back with hands that were steadier than she'd expected them to be, steadier than she probably deserved given the pressure behind her eyes. Then she started the bread. Because the bread still needed making. Because some things didn't pause for feeling, and she had learned long ago that this wasn't a cruelty, it was a gift. The work continued. which meant you continued, which meant the feeling and the work existed together, the way they had always existed together for her, the way they were finally the same thing, if you looked at it with enough honesty. She was still so smiling when the first boot hit the porch step 20 minutes later. The letter from Nebraska arrived on a Friday afternoon. It came in the stack of mail Callum brought back from the Greatstone Post on his weekly supply run, between a seed catalog and an overdue invoice from the hardware supplier in Cheyenne. The handwriting on the envelope was Mrs. Pierce's, the woman who had taken over managing Clover Hill after the board changed 3 years after Nora left. Not unkind, not warm. Practical in the way of someone writing about a practical problem with no room in the letter for anything that wasn't strictly necessary. Clover Hill Orphanage, Dunbar County, Nebraska. Nora read it standing at the kitchen window with the April light coming in at its particular angle. Long and thin and staring a sense of surprise, as though it hadn't entirely expected to still be here. The orphanage was closing. End of year. December at the latest, possibly sooner if the fall funding review went the way the board expected. The county had looked at the numbers and made its decision with the efficiency of people who thought in ledgers and had learned to keep children in a separate column where the math didn't have to apply. 14 children currently in residence. They would be placed with families, the letter said. Distributed. That was Mrs. Pierce's word. Distributed. Like dry goods. Like seed stock divided among separate parcels. Nora folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, stood at the window for a long time. She knew what distributed meant. She knew it from the inside. She had been distributed at 11 years old, sent to a farm family 2 counties over who needed a kitchen helper, and returned her 6 months later when the wife decided the arrangement was more expensive than it was useful. She had been distributed twice more before Clover Hill took her back, and Mrs. Hatch stood her in front of the stove and said, "Stay. Here, this is where you belong." The bread was in the oven. 15 minutes remaining. She sat at the table and did arithmetic on a piece of brown paper, her savings from 5 months at the ranch, the cost of a rented room near Dunbar County, what she could manage without help, in the most optimistic version of the numbers she could construct. The numbers came out honest, which was worse than coming out badly because you couldn't argue with honest numbers. They simply sat there, accurate and immovable, and told you what was. She folded the brown paper, placed it beside the letter. When the bread was done, she took it out, set it to cool, and went back to work. Later, she told herself, "You'll figure this out later." She didn't tell Silas. She told no one, because it was her problem, her history, her Clover Hill, her 14 children, who were not her children in any legal or blood sense, but who were hers in the way that places mark you permanently, the way that the people who kept you alive when you were small remain yours regardless of what the paperwork says. Except Callum Price told him. Not out of malice. Callum had seen the envelope when he handed the mail over, had read the return address, had seen the expression on Nora's face when she came back from the window to take the bread out of the oven. He had put these observations together with the quiet accuracy he'd been developing his entire life, and apparently, had mentioned Silas the following morning while helping bring water in from the well. Of course he did. The boy who said 8 words total in his first 6 weeks here is now. The kitchen door opened. Silas. He came in the way he always came in, no announcement, no theater, no performance of arrival. Just present, suddenly, the way he had been present at a market stall in November. Coat on, hat in hand, the particular set along his jaw that she had learned to read as, "He has decided something, and the deciding is done." He sat down across from her, which he had never done. He stood in this kitchen, or worked, or moved through on his way to something else. He did not sit across from her at the work table in the middle of a Friday afternoon like a man preparing to have a conversation he has thought about in advance. "Oh, I don't think I'm ready for the letter from Nebraska," he said. Nora set down the knife she'd been using to trim the herb stems. "Callum mentioned it," Silas continued. "Callum should apply his powers of observation to fence repair and leave my mail. You're leaving." Not a question. The way he said everything that mattered, as a statement offered for verification, not debate. Nora looked at him. "I'm considering it." "What would it take," he said, "to not?" She blinked. It isn't a question of what it would take. There are children at that orphanage who are going to be. "What would it take," he said. Same voice, same pace. the immovability of something that had been standing in the valley through worse weather than this. Nora looked at the table between them. He thinks this is a problem with a solution. He thinks he can apply resources to it. He doesn't understand that the problem isn't resources. The problem is that I don't have a reason to stay that I'm allowed to say out loud. She looked up. I don't have a reason to stay, she said. That's the whole of it. I have a reason to go. 14 reasons, all of them. Under 15 years old. And I have. She stopped. I don't have a reason here that I can. She stopped again, because she had arrived at something true, and she hadn't yet settled the question of whether she had the courage to say it to his face. Silas was looking at her. He was always looking at her. Not through her. Not past her or around her or at the space adjacent to where she was standing. At her ceased, specifically, the way he had looked at her the first time, at the market reading her sign and then looking at her as though she were a complete thing that deserved to be taken seriously. He did not look away. Vivienne left me something, he said. Nora waited. He reached into his coat, set an envelope on the table between them. She recognized the bank seal in the corner, the Cheyenne stamp, the particular weight of official correspondence. The debt is cleared, he said. The ranch is free of it. She settled the full amount before she left. I know, Nora said. She told Pearl she was going to, which means I have money I didn't have 4 months ago. He kept his eyes on her, and I can't think of a better use for it than making certain 14 children in Nebraska don't get distributed before winter. The word landed between them like something placed carefully. He had used her word, distributed. She hadn't said that word to anyone. It was in the letter. It was in the brown paper arithmetic she'd left on the table and then moved to her apron pocket. Callum. She was going to have a very specific conversation with Callum Price about the boundaries of helpfulness. You can't simply, she started. It isn't your responsibility to, I know it isn't. Then why? Because it's yours. He said it without decoration, and that's sufficient. Nora put her hands flat on the table, breathed. He doesn't understand what he's offering. He does, actually. That's the exact problem. He understands precisely what he's offering and what it means and what it would require of me to accept it. And I am sitting here pretending I don't understand any of that. And I think we both already know that I understand it completely. She looked at the envelope, then at him. That isn't the whole reason, she said. Silence. Is it? She added quietly. Silas held her gaze. He set his hat down on the table like a man settling in, like a man who has decided that whatever this conversation requires, he has the time for it. No, he said. It isn't. The room went very still. Outside, the creek was still making itself known. The sound of water that had been locked in ice since November, finally moving again, doing what it had always been designed to do. A cow called from the south field. A door swung somewhere in the barn. The ordinary continuous sounds of a working ranch proceeding without any awareness of what was happening inside this kitchen. Silas looked at his hat on the table, then back at her. Margaret's cookbook, he said. Nora went still in a different way. I know you found it, he said. No accusation in it, just a fact being named. The board has been loose since before It's been loose a long time. I kept meaning to fix it. Silas, she wrote in it. He said it the way he explains to himself as much as to her working it out in words, which was not his natural, but which this apparently required. She wrote in everything. Letters, notebooks, the margins of her Bible when the notebooks ran out. A pause. After she was gone, I couldn't go near it. I couldn't go near that kitchen for months. Nora said nothing. When Fletcher got sick and someone needed to account for the stores, I came back. I told myself it was for practical reasons. His voice remained level, careful in the way of something being handled with attention. That was not the reason. Why then? Nora said. Because she put herself in that room. He looked at his hands. Every meal she cooked in there, every time she banked the fire at night. It was still in the walls when I came back. I could feel it, The line of his jaw shifted once. I didn't know how to be in there without losing it. So I went in and I stayed close to the only pieces of her that were still present, which was the cast iron and the basin and the routine of the thing. That was all I had. The kitchen held the silence between them with the ease of something that had held harder ones. And then you came, Silas said. Nora breathed. And you didn't erase it. He looked up. That was what I'd been afraid of. That whoever came in would cook the feeling of her out of the room. Replace everything with something that had no connection to what was there before. He looked at her steadily. You brought her pot back out of the storeroom where I'd put it away. You kept the cast iron on the same hooks. The kitchen still carries the same quality underneath. Different on the surface, but underneath the same. You kept what was there while you made it yours. Don't, Nora, do not. That's just good kitchen management, she said. Her voice was not entirely reliable. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile. The shape a smile leaves behind in a face that's considering allowing one. The first weeks, he said, I stayed to wash the dishes because I needed a reason to remain in that room. After she was gone, there was no other reason I could justify. I know, and then. He exhaled, something releasing, then staying stopped being about that. It became about something else that I net some for and didn't know what to do with, because it had been 5 years and I hadn't expected to. He paused. Rebuilt. I hadn't known I was still capable of wanting to stay somewhere for a reason that had nothing to do with her. The creak said something outside, indecipherable, continuous. I'm not what you expected, Nora said. When you hired me. No, I'm not. She looked at her hands on the table. Rough, capable, flour-dusted even now, as they had been every day of her adult life, entirely and without apology themselves. I know what I am. I know what people see when they look at me. I have always known. Tell me what you think I see, he said. Not a question. A challenge offered gently, but a challenge. She met his eyes. Tell me, he said again, and I'll tell you whether you're right. She was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than comfortable, because this was it. This was the thing she had been carrying since, before she could have named it, since the first child at Clover Hill, who looked at her plate and then at her and laughed, since every matron and shopkeeper and market customer who registered before registering her, as every room she had walked into and felt the small collective recalibration that happened when people decided what category she belonged in. The belief she had constructed over 26 years. Reinforced so thoroughly and for so long that she had stopped experiencing it as a belief and had started experiencing it as simple fact. The same way she experienced the cold as fact and the distance between kitchen and the bunkhouse as fact. That she was capable, acceptable, worth keeping around, but not the kind of woman a man like this looked at. Not the kind of woman who got to stay because someone wanted her there. She said it, not dramatically. Not as an accusation or a performance of vulnerability. Just honestly, she did most things because dishonesty required an energy she had never been willing to spend. I've spent my whole life believing I wasn't the kind of person who got to want things like this, she said, not because anyone said it plainly. They didn't need to. It was in the way rooms rearranged themselves when I walked in the way conversations made small adjustments. I learned to want things that were practical, achievable on my own terms without requiring anyone else to. She stopped, found the word, to choose me. The word sat between them, choose. Because that was the impossible part, she said. Not the working, not the earning, not making myself useful enough that people kept me around. I could always do that. I learned it young and I never stopped. But the idea that someone would look at me and choose, deliberately, not because I was convenient or necessary or because I'd made myself too useful to remove, her voice held, because they wanted to. Silas didn't move, didn't adjust his gaze. I'm choosing, he said. 2 words. Quiet as the bread cooling on the rack behind her. Quiet as the fire settling in the hearth. Quiet as everything that had been building in this kitchen since November and had finally arrived at the place where it needed to be said. Specifically, she said, because she needed the specific. She had earned the specific. Specifically, he said, you, this, whatever this is and whatever it becomes. A pause. Not because you run this kitchen well, not because the men eat better than they have in years, because, he looked at the table once, briefly, then back at her, because you found Margaret's cookbook and you took care of it instead of throwing it out. Because you put her pot back on the hook where it belonged. Because you leave a plate for a boy who can't ask for it, and you've never once made him feel the cost of needing it. Because you ran yourself into the ground for men who hadn't been decent to you, and you did it without tallying what they owed you. He picked up his hat, put it back down, and pay cuz, he said, the first morning you walked through that gate, and Gideon said what he said, you kept walking. You didn't flinch. You didn't stop. You just kept walking. Nora stared at him. He saw that. He was there, and he saw it, and he has been watching this whole time the same way I have. Stay, he said. Not because of the ranch, not because of the men, not because of Nebraska, though we'll handle Nebraska, that's already decided. He held her gaze with the directness of a man who had very few words and was using them all. Stay because you want to be here. And if you don't want to, if you need to go, I'll make certain you have everything you need to do what you're going to do. I mean that without condition. She knew he meant it. That was the part that finally moved something loose inside her. Not the words themselves, but absolute, unperformative certainty that he meant every one of them. That the offer was as genuine as the request to stay. That both were real. That she was, for the first time in her life, being given a choice that was actually a choice. But if you stay, he said, know that I'm not asking you to be useful. I'm asking you to be here. The kitchen was warm. It was always warm now. Nora looked at the apron she was wearing, at the word stitched across it in 24 different hands, at the cast iron hanging on the hooks, at the loose board over the shelf behind which a woman she had never met had written her marriage in recipe margins. She looked at Silas Holt, who was looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been sitting with for 5 years without knowing what form the answer would take. I need to help the orphanage, she said. Yes, that's not negotiable. It's not a negotiation. And I need, she stopped, gathered herself. I need things to be. Tell me what you need, he said, and we'll work it out. We, simple word, one syllable. He said it like it had already been true for some time, and he was only now saying it aloud. Nora breathed in, breathed out. All right, she said. All right. All right, she said again. I'll stay. He nodded once, the nod of a man who expected this outcome and is allowing himself exactly this much acknowledgement of the fact. Then he stood, picked up his hat, put it on, walked to the door, stopped, turned back, just slightly. The bread, he said. Is it done? She stared at him. Is he, after all of that? He's asking about the yes, she managed. It came out an hour ago. Good. He nodded at the rack where it sat cooling. Smells right, and he walked out. Nora stood in the middle of the kitchen, looked at the closed door, looked at the bread, and then she laughed. The real kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere, that doesn't consult you first and doesn't wait for permission. The kind she hadn't used in so long she'd half forgotten it was still operational. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, shook her head slowly. Smells right. That man. That absolute impossible. She went back to work, still smiling. November 1882, 1 year. The kitchen was the same and very different. Both of these things true simultaneously without contradiction. The cast iron on the same hooks. Margaret's pot in regular rotation, washed and dried and re-seasoned and used the way good tools were meant to be used. Constantly, without ceremony, until the use itself became the form of respect. The loose board still loose. She had told Silas about it in June, and he had stood in front of it for a long moment, hand resting on the panel, and then looked at her. They had decided together, without many words, to leave it. Some things didn't need fixing. Some things only needed knowing about. The dining room had grown in September. A doorway cut through to a new room, long tables, benches, space enough for twice the original number. Families from the neighboring ranches came on Sunday evenings. No one had formally invited them. The smell of what came out of Nora's kitchen had done the inviting, carried on in the air across distances that should have been too far, and apparently weren't. There was always enough. There was always enough because Nora ran the kitchen, and Nora had grown up in a place where enough was never guaranteed and had spent her entire adult life making certain that it was. Callum Price was 18 now. He was learning carpentry from a man in Greystone on his days off, measuring, fitting, understanding how things that were built correct while Lisa stayed till topped for in the kitchen. He had stopped looking like a boy deciding whether to bolt and had begun looking like a young man deciding what to build next. The difference was visible in the way he held his shoulders. Gideon Marsh had, without acknowledging it to anyone, learned 3 recipes. Nora had observed him twice, standing at the stove when he believed the kitchen was empty, doing things with a spoon that were definitively cooking rather than casual tasting. Both times she had quietly reversed her entry and found somewhere else to be for the next 10 minutes. Because some things were better received as privacy than as witness. Pearl Running Water had stopped coming on Tuesdays solely to deliver herbs. The herbs were still technically the reason. The herbs were mentioned. But Pearl arrived now at the time when the morning work had settled and the coffee was fresh. And she stayed for the portion of the morning that had nothing to do with medicinal plants, everything to do with the conversation that happened between 2 women who had learned to talk to each other honestly. Neither of them had named this arrangement. Naming it would have introduced a formality that neither of them wanted. The orphanage at Clover Hill had not closed. Silas had sent the funds in October. No ceremony, no performance of generosity, just a letter in his particular direct language. Here is money. Use it for the children. We'll discuss the arrangement for next year since the spring gives us room to think. They had discussed it in correspondence through the winter, which Nora had managed from the kitchen table with her coffee and Pearl's opinions on several tangential matters. The arrangement held. The arrangement would continue. In the summer, 3 children from Clover Hill had come to Holt's Ridge for 8 weeks. They had built for correctly, to make bread that came out the same 2 days running, to tend a kitchen garden through the dry weeks of July, to understand that cooking for people was different from cooking for survival, though Nora had been honest with them that the difference was mostly emphasis. The foundation was the same. You paid attention. You built stores. You cooked for the appetite you hadn't seen yet. One girl, 11 years old, stubborn in the specific way Nora recognized from the inside out, had asked her one evening near the end of the summer why she had stayed at the ranch. Nora thought about it honestly before answering, because the girl deserved an honest answer rather than a tidy one. Because someone gave me a real choice, she said, and I hadn't been given one of those before. The girl turned this over. What's the difference between a choice and one that isn't? A real choice, Nora said, setting the bread knife down, is when both options are genuinely available. When yes and no are both possible and both will be respected. She looked at the girl. A false choice is when one option is real and the other is dressed up to look like an option but has no actual weight behind it. You can feel the difference usually. The trouble is learning to trust what you feel. The girl was quiet for a moment. Did you trust it? She asked. When it happened to you? Nora smiled. Eventually, she said. It took me a little time, but I got there. That was the truest answer she had. The letter from a girl in Millhaven arrived in October. 3 counties east, 17 years old, referred by a woman who had eaten diner at Holt's Ridge and mentioned the cook and the whole improbable story of how a Wyoming cattle ranch had become a place where strangers drove distances to eat on a Sunday evening. The letter was 4 sentences. I am not what people want me to be. I am not what they expect. I was taught that wanting things was not something available to people like me. How do you learn to want things again? Nora read it twice, sat with it. Then she got a piece of paper and wrote back. Not long, not philosophical, not the kind of letter that explained things from the outside. The kind that came from the inside me, from knowing the exact weight of what the girl was describing, because she had carried it herself. I spent a long time believing certain things weren't available to me. Love, being chosen, staying somewhere that felt like mine. I was wrong. But I'd been wrong about it for so long that I couldn't think my way out of it. I had to be shown, not by someone telling me I deserved better, because people say things like that and it doesn't move anything. I had to be given a choice by someone who meant both options. And then I had to decide what I actually wanted. That was when I found out. So here is what I'd tell you. Stop waiting until you feel certain you deserve the thing before you reach for it. You won't get there by waiting. Find one small thing you want. Today, something real and specific, and choose it. Not because you've proven yourself worthy of it. Because you want it. Do that enough times and something shifts. I can't tell you exactly how, but it does. Nora Bassett Holt. She read it back, folded it, sealed it, set it on the outgoing stack. The name at the bottom, Holt, had become hers in August in a ceremony that involved the justice of the peace from Greystone as witness when Gideon's Marsh, standing in the back of the room with his hat in his hands, looking like a man attending something he considered important enough to wear a clean shirt for. Callum had been there too, standing straight, looking like he'd been expecting this since approximately February, and was glad it had finally been organized. Silas had said what needed saying. Nora had said what needed saying. The justice of the peace had done his part, and then they had all gone back to the ranch, and Nora had made dinner for 24 men and 3 visiting families. Sunday meant the dining room was open and people were coming regardless of what else was happening. Silas had washed the dishes, same as every night. Nothing about that had changed. That final evening in November, the evening she sent the letter to Millhaven, the last Sunday families had gone an hour past. The dining room was cleared, the bread for Monday already mixed and covered with cloth and left to rise overnight. Nora was wiping down the work table when she heard it. Water running in the scullery, and beneath it, very quiet, almost below the threshold of conscious use, whistling. Silas, washing the last pot of the evening, whistling something low and tuneless, and entirely without self-consciousness, the way a person makes sound when they're alone and comfortable and not thinking about whether anyone is listening. Nora put down the cloth, listened. The fire ticked in the hearth. The pot moved against the basin. The whistling continued, small and private and warm, the sound of a man who was comfortable where he was, who was not somewhere else in his head, who was here in this kitchen at this hour and found that sufficient, found it in fact enough. She didn't go in, didn't call out, didn't do anything that would interrupt the particular quality of the moment, which was not about her and didn't need to be. She stood at the work table in the kitchen that was her and his and Margaret's and 24 men's and 3 children from Nebraska and Pearl's Tuesday morning and one girl in Millhaven she had never met. All of it at once, all of it, layered, present, and indistinguishable now from each other, the way rings inside timber are indistinguishable from the tree. She felt it, what she had been circling since November of last year without being able to land on it. What was dramatic. That part had surprised her, genuinely. She had assumed the important feelings announced themselves with corresponding weight. A change in light, a moment of recognition that arrived with its own awareness. She had assumed you would know when it happened, but it was just this: warm kitchen, fire ticking, water running. A man whistling because he was somewhere he wanted to be, because she was there. She pressed both hands flat on the work table. The wood was smooth beneath her palms, worn by Margaret's years and her own, layered now, one over the other, the layers no longer separable. This was what time did to the things people cared for. It made them into something that contained all the caring at once, all of it present simultaneously, none of it erasing what came before. She had not erased Margaret. She had become part of the same kitchen, and the kitchen held them both. The woman who had written her marriage in recipe margins, and the woman who had found those margins and understood them. The way good kitchens held everything that had happened inside them. Quietly, without ceremony, with nothing to offer except warmth and continuity and the fact of the fire still going, which was, she understood now, everything, which had always been everything. She smiled, not for anyone watching. There was no one watching, just for herself in the warm kitchen, in the life she had chosen after finally being given a real choice. Which was, she had come to understand where all the good things started, not in being chosen, in choosing. The whistling continued softly from the scullery, the fire held. The bread rose in the dark slows and certain, the way good things did.